Sunday, the 1st of May, 1960. Sverdlovsk Oblast, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, 5:36 a.m. Major Mikhail Voronov, commander of an S-75 Dvina surface-to-air missile battery, receives an order from Lieutenant General of the Air Force Yevgeny Savitsky that a hostile aircraft has ingressed Soviet airspace and he is ordered to immediately engage and destroy the target. Major Voronov fires 3 missiles. The second one hits nothing. The third one inadvertently hits and destroys a Soviet MiG-19, killing the pilot, Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov. But the first missile finds its mark. And the Lockheed U-2 spy plane being piloted by 29-year-old American CIA agent and former Air Force fighter pilot Francis Gary Powers of Jenkins, Kentucky, is shot down. Powers is under strict orders not to be captured alive. The CIA has provided him with a fake silver dollar that has a hidden saxitoxin needle inside it, which will kill him within moments if he pricks his skin with it, which he is supposed to do in order to avoid any eventuality where he falls into the hands of the enemy in a non-dead condition. But in the event, Powers makes a different call. He decides he doesn't feel much like committing suicide, and since I'm wearing a perfectly good parachute, he figures, I think I'll just bail out of the aircraft instead and take my chances, which he proceeds to do. After having a bit of a wrestling match with his oxygen hose, he manages to get free of the crippled airplane and get to ground safely, where he is promptly taken into Soviet custody. Meanwhile, back in Washington, President Eisenhower knows he's got a problem, but he doesn't think it's a very big problem, at least not yet. The conventional wisdom up to this point has been that first, the Soviets, they don't even have any missiles that can reach the cruising altitude of our U-2s. And that there's an interview with Powers from years after he was released where he sort of chuckles at that whole thing since, well, the way I figured it, if they can launch a satellite into space in 1957, they can probably shoot down a U-2 in 1960. And it's hard to argue with this rationale, frankly, but even if they do manage to shoot one of these things down, the thinking went, it'll get so pulverized on impact from 70,000 feet that none of the wreckage will be identifiable as surveillance equipment. And if the pilot goes against his orders and tries to bail out instead of whacking himself with the magic shellfish poison needle, well, the ejection is unlikely to be survivable at that airspeed and altitude anyway, so we should be good. In the worst case scenario, they will recover a dead pilot and a bit of wreckage that is mangled beyond all recognition. But as happens so often with conventional wisdom, the conventional wisdom wound up being all wrong. First of all, they very much did have missiles that could reach that altitude, and they had been shooting them at all of the previous 23 U-2 overflights. They just needed some time to improve their aim is all. And the ejection altitude didn't wind up being all that much of an issue because by the time he managed to blow the canopy and egress the aircraft, he was all the way down at 30,000 feet. And far from being pulverized on impact, the U-2 wound up in 4 big recognizable pieces. The self-destruct mechanism on the freaking camera didn't even succeed in blowing up all of the exposed film. So Powers fails to land as scheduled at the CIA black site in Norway. Then a day goes by. Then another day goes by. And the Russians, they are not saying jack shit about anything. So the Pentagon and the State Department, they decide, well, we better get ahead of this thing, guys. And the cover story, which went out on the 3rd day, was, well, we've got these high-altitude planes that NASA uses for these meteorological and scientific flights. And the other day, one of our NASA pilots radioed in a message saying that he was having difficulty with his oxygen supply. So we think this poor bastard might have become incapacitated and lost consciousness, and there's a possibility that maybe the aircraft then inadvertently strayed over Soviet airspace while it was under autopilot. We just wanted to give you guys a heads up, so in case you find some twisted wreckage and a dead body, that's probably our guy. And gosh, we sure are sorry about this totally inadvertent overflight that was unrelated in any way to any sort of military espionage. Then a 3rd day goes by, and then a 4th day. Still not a peep from anybody in the Kremlin. Finally, on the 5th day comes a statement saying, a U.S. spy plane has been shot down over Soviet territory. Khrushchev doesn't say anything about the fate of the pilot, and here we have a great example of that old axiom that says you should always give a man just enough rope with which to hang himself. Khrushchev's omission causes everybody in the Pentagon and the State Department to conclude, stupidly, that this must mean Powers is dead and they didn't recover his body. They just got the plane, so great. But just for good measure, they thought, let's add a few more little flourishes and embellishments to our cover story just for the hell of it. First, let's take one of our other U-2s, let's paint a NASA logo on the side of it, and we'll photograph it in front of a NASA hangar. And then, hey, you guys are going to love this one, let's put out a bulletin that says the whole U-2 fleet is temporarily grounded for inspection of the oxygen systems. Because, we just want to make sure that no more of our pilots lose consciousness and accidentally overfly the Soviet Union. Boy, we sure fooled those Ruskies this time, didn't we, boys? And then, on the 7th day, Khrushchev comes out to meet the world press with a big shit-eating grin on his face, and he says, quote, I must tell you a secret. When I made my first report, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well. And now, just look how many silly things the Americans have said. End quote. Now, let's go ahead and wrap up the story on the other side. And if you're wondering why I'm bringing this story up tonight, well, it has something to do with Abrams tanks and Ukraine. So stay tuned while Jim Eagle hits the music. From high atop the battlements of Castle Curmudgeon, where you should never underestimate the Swiss army because those guys know 500 ways to kill you with a toothpick and a corkscrew. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. America, and all ships at sea. Welcome to the program. I am your eponymous host and humble servant. So, when Khrushchev springs his trap on the 7th day, the trap the Americans had waltzed into beyond his wildest dreams, it was 1 week before he and Eisenhower were supposed to have a big summit meeting in Paris, and there were extremely high hopes for this thing, so much so that people were already calling it the Paris Peace Summit. And by this point, Eisenhower has hosted 2 visits to the United States by Khrushchev. There was the World's Fair Kitchen Summit trip back in 1954, and there was a second trip to Camp David in 1959, and it was during that second trip that there had been very positive discussions with a view toward possibly signing some sort of nuclear non-proliferation treaty at some time in the near future, and it was thought that the Paris Peace Summit the next year, 1960, was quite possibly going to be the event that produced such an agreement, if everything went according to plan. But Eisenhower has a problem. He wants to pursue non-proliferation. He wants to sign a treaty. But he is uneasy about doing it when he has such an imperfect understanding of the Soviet Union's actual offensive capabilities and the actual size of their missile stockpile. It's an election year in 1960. Eisenhower is in the final year of his second term, and the candidates who are vying for the Democratic nomination, including Senator Lyndon Johnson of Texas and Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts, they keep telling the country that there is something called a missile gap, that the Soviets have a massively bigger stockpile of offensive nuclear weapons than we do, and President Eisenhower is the responsible party who has created this intolerable situation. Therefore, that's why you should throw the Republicans out of the White House in November and vote for our guy instead of Vice President Nixon. So when Eisenhower first authorizes the U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union, he does it for 2 reasons. One, because he needs to have a clearer picture of what he is up against before he contemplates agreeing to any arms reduction treaties at the Paris Peace Summit. And 2, because he would very much like to gather definitive intelligence that dispels the notion of any missile gap actually existing and thus helps improve his party's chances of retaining the presidency. He knew it was a hell of a big risk to take, but he felt like he had to take it. They fly 22 of the missions, everything goes just swell, they gain volumes of valuable photographic intelligence, and they're not planning on flying anymore. But Allen Dulles, the CIA director, comes to see Ike 2 weeks before the Paris summit, and he says, Mr. President, I think it's crucially important that we conduct just 2 more flights before the summit. Our people, they have identified a couple more potential sites that we haven't got eyes on yet. And if we got pictures of those, it can help us get a better understanding of the big picture before we go in and start negotiating with these guys. Now, Ike doesn't have a very good feeling about it. He feels like he's tempting fate and should quit while he's ahead. But Dulles manages to convince him, and he authorizes the flights. And then, son of a bitch, just the thing I was afraid of, Gary Powers gets himself shot down and captured alive. So we've been caught in a brazenly illegal act of international espionage right on the eve of the summit meeting, where we were supposed to be building upon a foundation of mutual trust that we've been developing over the previous 6 years. But that's all shot to shit now. And since we decided to lie about it and make up a cover story that wound up being exposed in short order as a rather comical bit of fiction, we now are a global laughingstock, in addition to looking like practitioners of the most odious, most underhanded sort of diplomatic duplicity. On the 9th day, Khrushchev tells Ike he can go get fucked. We're not having any peace summit, he says. I can't deal in good faith with a counterpart who has demonstrated by his own conduct that he is not dealing in good faith with me. In the Soviet Union, we have ethical standards, don't you know? But back to the mythical missile gap for just a moment. There never was any actual missile gap, of course, but Senator John Kennedy of Massachusetts wound up riding that missile gap all the way to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. You can go back and look at his speeches from that 1960 campaign, and the thing you will hear more often than any other thing is missile gap, missile gap, missile gap. The whole central thesis of his campaign wound up being that under the bumbling, inattentive leadership of that tired old man Dwight Eisenhower, the Soviets had been allowed to build up a massive strategic advantage over us, and this is completely intolerable, and Vice President Nixon is the agent of the administration that stood back and allowed this to happen. Therefore, vote for me instead. Plus, I'm way more handsome than he is. As for Eisenhower, he wasn't born yesterday. He could see exactly what the hell was happening, and that's that the defense contractors, well, they really wanted some big, fat, lucrative missile contracts. Therefore, they had a vested interest in promoting the idea of a missile gap existing, and thus a vested interest in giving financial support to presidential candidates who say there is a missile gap. And what do you know? The guy who campaigned on the missile gap wound up winning the presidency with the full support of the defense contractors. And this is how we arrive at Eisenhower's farewell address, where he famously gave us a very detailed list of warnings, all of which we have utterly failed to heed, about what is likely to happen if we allow our political establishment to be co-opted by the military-industrial complex. Which brings us to the present day and Joe Biden's current proxy war with Russia, which he is very desirous to see turn into an actual open war. You know why? Because even as in a state of advanced cognitive decline, Joe Biden still retains just enough vestigial lucidity that he can damn well see when he is starting to be thrown under the bus by his own party. He knows there is a scandal a-brewing that could not only deny him his party's nomination in 2024, but could very well see him forced out of office. And the only way of forestalling that is by making himself a wartime president. Because then you can fall back on that good old narrative of, oh, come on, man, we can't go making leadership changes when we're at war. That's not fair to the troops. That's crazy talk. We owe it to our men in uniform to keep a steady hand on the tiller. And yes, if that sounds eerily reminiscent of George W. Bush's 2004 re-election campaign, that's not an accident. The other thing that Joe Biden can do in pursuit of self-salvation is to be an absolute all-out $5 street whore for the military-industrial complex. Oh, you guys say you want to build more weapons to send to Ukraine? Would 45 billion U.S. taxpayer dollars be enough, or do you need more than that? Look, we might have to break it up into smaller installments, but don't you guys worry, because we've got bipartisan support on this thing. For Christ's sake, have you ever met Lindsey Graham? That guy drifts off to sleep each night, dreaming about killing Russians. You won't be surprised to learn, therefore, that Lindsey Graham has been one of the main architects of this deal that's going to see 31 American M1A1 Abrams battle tanks sent to Ukraine. So, let's talk about the logistics of this whole thing. It takes 22 weeks for the U.S. Army to train an American soldier to be a crewman on an Abrams tank, and obviously each one of those guys is already fully trained as an infantryman. If you want to be an Abrams tank commander, you are not even allowed to apply for that position unless you are at least an E6 and have prior experience as an Abrams gunner, loader, or driver. How long does it take to get to E6? Well, if you can do it in a dozen years, you're on the fast track. 15 is probably more typical. So what does that all add up to? Well, you're looking at a total of around 17.5 man-years on average of cumulative training and experience for an Abrams tank crew in the U.S. Army to be permitted to take that vehicle into battle. And here's another fun fact. Those American soldiers that you're training can already speak and read English when you begin training them, meaning they can actually read the instruments and the displays inside the vehicle. I am pretty sure there's no Google smartphone app where you can magically make everything be in Ukrainian. Which is to say, if the official story here is that Ukrainian personnel are going to be operating these tanks, you're going to have to teach them English before you can even get them to square one and begin their actual training. But the warmongering slimeball grifter asshole class in Washington, they announced this deal and that they make it sound like we're just going to drive these 31 tanks up to the border, toss the keys to our Ukrainian friends, and be like, here you go, boys, you go and give those Ruskies hell, woo! And it's not just the tank crew you have to train either. Training up the maintenance crew takes nearly as many man-years as training up the crew in the vehicle. So never mind who's going to drive and load and shoot and command, who the hell are the mechanics going to be? Because I got news for you. You're going to have to teach those guys all English too. There ain't no Ukrainian language version of the M1A1 Abrams technical manual. So where am I going with all this? Well, if the idea is to have these 31 tanks be wielded effectively on the field of battle, if you're going to do it with Ukrainian tank crews and maintenance crews, the training is going to require 2 or 3 years at minimum. Best case scenario. But wild-eyed maniacs like Joe Biden and Lindsey Graham, damn it, they don't have that long to wait. We need to get these tanks in the field and start killing those damn Ruskies. And we all know what the final result is going to be. American tank crews will wind up doing the fighting. They will try their damnedest to keep it a secret. But you know what's inevitably going to happen? One of those tank crews will be captured alive by the Russians. And then Vladimir Putin will have 4 Gary Powerses to do whatever the hell he wants with. Would he take that as a sufficient provocation to justify launching nukes? Who knows? He sure as hell might. I also know that General and President Dwight Eisenhower would be double face-palming so hard right now if he could see this shit. He gave us all the warning that a leader can possibly give to his people. If there was anybody who knew what he was talking about, who had earned the advice to have the right to have his advice heeded, it was that guy. But we ignored him. And all the things he warned against have come to pass just as he said they would. And not to put too depressing of a point on it, but the consequence of our ignorance could still very well be nuclear Armageddon. Thank you very much for watching. See you Friday. Do not comply. Get off my lawn.